You might think, if you've been following my argument so far through the previous sections of this course, that I would now get to the point where I would grandly declare that we are proving the existence of God, now that we've seen all that we've seen about justice and spirituality and relationships and beauty, that now we are mounting an argument which enables us to declare we believe that God exists, QED. Well, it isn't actually like that. Trying to prove that God exists by some sort of human logic is like somebody who, being quite used to lighting candles in order to go and see where the power socket is, where the plug has failed, then decides to take a similar candle out of doors in the morning to see whether the sun has risen yet. Of course, that's totally absurd. You wouldn't do any such thing. When the sun is risen, you don't need candles anymore. And most people in the world who actually do believe in God as something much greater, someone much greater than anything that we could actually prove or demonstrate or even explore properly through our own rather puny human logic. So what I'm trying to do from here on is not to say, therefore God exists, but to say, granted these questions and puzzles that we human beings seem to find ourselves saddled with, whether we like it or not, are there stories that we can tell? Are there ways, themes, things that we can explore which will enable us to see a world in which all that would settle down and make sense, in which we could make sense of it, not in order then to prove God, but in order to say, if God really is like this, then we might actually expect that it would be so. And it is that sort of argument that I'm advancing in this book and in this series. But part of the problem that we face right off the top is, of course, the meaning of the word God itself. Many people today just assume that the word God is what we call univocal, that is, it always means the same, no matter who is saying it. Now, you only have to think for a bit about ancient history or many other religions to realize that that really isn't so. That if you go to the East and look at the great Hindu systems, the gods and goddesses of Hinduism are quite different both from one another and from the God you find, say, in the Old Testament, or the God of whom Jesus speaks. But many people still in our culture think that if you meet someone on the street and say, do you believe in God? And they say yes or no, we all know which God it is that they're saying they believe in. And that is really quite a puzzle, because different people actually have quite significantly different ideas of who God is. And part of the reason why we have so much difficulty often in church, in understanding each other within the church, or in communicating what we believe about God to the world outside, is that we haven't actually plumbed the depths, got to the heart of the question of what this word God actually means. In order to understand something about how we can at least approach that question, I want to make a distinction between three ways of looking at the world, at the universe, at everything, which is enormously important both for understanding God and for understanding pretty well everything else that I'm going to be talking about in this book and in this series. So let's take a deep breath and go for it one by one. I want you to hold in your minds a picture of heaven and earth. What do you think of when I say heaven and earth? Do you think perhaps of heaven and earth as really the same place, joined together, fused together, so that heaven is simply a dimension of earth, or earth is simply a dimension of heaven? Many people do think like that. Or do you think perhaps of heaven and earth as miles away from each other? Or perhaps I should say miles away like that, up and down. So that if you're in heaven, you're a long way from earth, and if you're on earth, you're a long way away from heaven. Many people think like that. Or is it somehow more complicated than that? Is there a more interesting and intricate relationship between heaven and earth? In the Bible, in the Old Testament, heaven is spoken of as God's sphere of reality. Heaven is God's home, the place where God lives, and earth is our home. It's the place where we live. But when we've talked about heaven and earth, in Western culture at least, often we've gone for either option 1 or option 2. And that is so going way back 2,000 years, as well as more recently within our own modern culture. Take option 1, commonly known as Pantheism, with a variety of variations within it. Many people have imagined that heaven and earth really do belong together in a tight-knit reality, so that when we look at the world and see that there are forces within it and powers within it, we say this is because there is a divinity within the world, which is shaping it and driving it and energizing it. Some evolutionary ideologies have thought like that as well, that there is a divine force which is causing the world to go forward, whether it wants to or not, driving it on. Some people have come at that through meditation on the forces of nature, on the sea, on the sun, on the trees, on the harvests, and they've seen divine forces within all of these and more. And so they've said, if there is a heaven, it is part of the life of this earth, and it's very powerful and very dramatic, and we should be able to get in touch with it because it's part of us as well. And that has been making a comeback recently. In the ancient world, it was the philosophy known as Stoicism. In our modern world, we see it through some New Age nature mysticisms and other movements of that sort. But at the same time, many people in our culture still cling to some form or another of dualism, of heaven and earth being a long way away from one another. In the ancient world, people who thought like that included the Epicureans, who thought that God or the gods lived a long way away from us. They were supremely happy, partly because they didn't have anything to do with the rest of us, and the best thing we could do was doff our caps to them at a distance, acknowledge them, but then get on organizing the world the way we wanted to, without really very much reference to those distant gods. I suspect that if you were to walk out on the street and ask the first person that you met, what is your idea of God, they might come up with something rather like that, a distant, detached being living in a remote heaven, not terribly concerned with what we're up to, except from time to time looking down and seeing that we're doing something silly or naughty and telling us we shouldn't, which this God in this picture tends to do. The good news in the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, is that the God of the Bible is neither the pantheist God nor the dualist God. He, or it usually is he in the Old Testament, is quite different from that. And we need to take a moment just to explore that. When we find the story of Abraham in the Old Testament, we find that Abraham meets God, or actually meets angels or people who it turns out are God in person. There are some very strange stories where Abraham has a conversation, doesn't realize until later that it is actually God he's dealing with. Or think of Jacob wrestling with the angel, or is it an angel? Is it not actually God himself who has been wrestling with Jacob? When we find Moses is in the wilderness and he finds a bush that's burning and yet not being consumed, and he's told, take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. And when later Moses leads the children of Israel en bloc through the wilderness, there is a strange fiery cloudy pillar which is going with them, a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, which guides them through the wilderness. And that is the presence of God with them. And in all these stories, we see not a God who's remote and detached and barking orders from a great distance, nor a God who is simply one of the forces of nature, or perhaps all the forces of nature rolled into one, but a God who is both other than these people, other than the world, and yet present in the world, present to and with the people whom this God has chosen and called. And all of those stories reach their climax in the Old Testament with the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness as a tent for this pillar of cloud and fire to live in, and then the fulfillment of that in turn is the building of the temple in Jerusalem, which becomes the place of which this God says, This is where I'm going to live. This is where I'm going to place my name. This is my home. So that much to our surprise, if we come with either option 1, the pantheist option, or option 2, the dualist option, the temple stands as a symbol central to Judaism for the whole of the period since the time of King David in roughly 1000 BC. The temple stands as a symbol for the fact that the true and living God, the Creator, wants to be with his people, to live in their midst, to welcome them to himself, to forgive their sins, so that they are with him and for him and loved by him, but not reducing him to terms of a force of nature, nor banishing him off to some distant cloud upstairs. Living with this God is a dangerous business, it turns out. And as the story unwinds through the Old Testament, so we find all kinds of puzzles and difficulties about how we talk about this God as the God who is Israel's God when Israel is so rebellious. And eventually, of course, the temple is destroyed and the people are sent away from God's land. So living with this God is not comfortable and not easy. It's demanding and challenging and puzzling at the same time. But in the Bible, as we go forward, we find again and again that it is this third option, this overlap of heaven and earth, this interlocking of the twin realities, which characterizes not only Jewish thought, but also Christian thought. And that's why, for instance, in the early church, the early Christians spoke about Jesus often with imagery taken from or borrowed from Jewish language about the temple. It's quite extraordinary, really, how little people have reflected on this in Christian discourse in recent days. But actually, Jesus of Nazareth appears in the New Testament almost as though he were the temple in person, the place where heaven and earth actually did overlap and interlock. But when we get to this sort of question, and we'll be coming back to Jesus, of course, in a later section, we're faced at once with the question, if heaven and earth really do overlap and interlock, then why is the world in such a mess? Why is there such a thing as evil? Now, we might pause on that for a moment and ask what happens about the problem of evil in pantheism on the one hand or in dualism on the other. The pantheist actually finds it very difficult to give an account of evil, because if we look at the world and say everything here is basically shot through with the divine, all of this earth is simply a place which is also heaven in disguise, if you like, then it's very difficult to say of anything in the world that is actually evil. And some theologians who've tried to explore a kind of New Age, anti-dualistic theology in our own day, talk about transcending the distinction not only between heaven and earth, but between good and evil. I find that very disturbing and perplexing because, for two reasons really. First, the Bible itself is very clear that there is such a thing as evil, that it is a radical problem within God's good world, not to be wished away like that. And second, because I think I live in the real world and I know people whose lives have been dramatically damaged by real radical evil, wicked things that have been done to them or their families or whoever. And so I think it's actually very difficult to opt for the pantheist view unless you're prepared to say, well, from time to time bad things happen, and if that happens you just have to shrug your shoulders because the world is how it is, because it's basically divine. So pantheism has a problem with evil in giving an analysis of it, still more giving any kind of a solution to it. The dualist, the Epicurean, has less problem because if God is far away, you wouldn't expect the world to be perfect. So yeah, well, we get into a mess and that's the way it is. But though the dualist can say that we've got an analysis of evil, that the world and God are so unalike, the dualist finds it very difficult to have an answer to the problem of evil, except, of course, that maybe you should escape from this world and go off and live with God instead of being in this world. And it is that impulse which sadly a lot of people today think is actually what Christianity is all about, it is that impulse that has given rise to modern forms of what is called Gnosticism, the idea that there is a secret gnosis or knowledge, and if you discover this knowledge deep within yourself, it'll enable you to escape from this wicked world and go off into the unknown beyond, or rather into the beyond that you are starting to come to know, and that you will therefore be one of the elite, one of the special ones who can escape from earth and go to heaven. Now, the problem of evil is, for the Christian as for the Jew, deep and radical. But the picture of heaven and earth overlapping, and of God somehow being present mysteriously and puzzlingly within the world, is the context in which the Old Testament Jews and the New Testament Christians grappled with that same problem of evil and came up with a solution which is more shocking and startling than anything else that we find in any other religious or philosophical systems known to the human race. I'll be coming back to that, of course, in a later section. But for now, let's just remind ourselves of how this works. In the Bible, God is not remote. In the Bible, God is not simply a force of nature. God is the one who is present mysteriously, calling, challenging, calling, yes, like those echoes of a voice that we heard round the corner, calling with a voice that we somehow recognize, because in the Bible, the God who made the world and loves the world is the God in whose image we humans are made. And one of the most dramatic developments ever in theology in the whole history of the world was to say that the God who made humans in his own image one day came and became a human being himself. And that is the theme that we now have to approach by a rather oblique route through the next section, by considering the people of Israel, the people whom God called to be the special people for the sake of the world, and then at last by considering Jesus himself.